Hello and welcome back to Sinobabble. This week's episode falls into my favourite category, which is people making predictions about China that end up being disastrously wrong. A few months ago, I came across a thread on X that was essentially discussing reactions at the time to the abolition of presidential term limits in China back in 2018 that essentially allowed Xi to become ruler indefinitely. I remember at the time as well, there was kind of like a lot of discussion about Xi making a power grab and how it had taken everybody by surprise and, how nobody either within China or without China had seen this coming. Now, at the time, I didn't really take any of this in. I kind of just saw it in the news and was like, okay. Like, to me, it wasn't completely unexpected, not because I had seen it coming, but because in my mind, China had always trended more conservative authoritarian than like liberal, democratic, whatever that means, even if that's just in the sense of democracy in terms of intra-party democracy within a one-party state with a supreme leader who takes consensus and has like collective leadership. Whenever it's been tried in China, it hasn't ended well and it doesn't last for very long. So at the time, I didn't really look into any of the discussions that were going on around it. But kind of reflecting on it, I'm curious to see what it is exactly that people feel like they missed about Xi coming to his position of ultimate power. I want to know, what were the signals? Because there must have been some sort of signal, right, that this was going to happen. It couldn't have just happened out of the blue. If you read a lot of articles from the time, they will say things like, this was like a swift power grab that nobody saw coming and nobody wanted. But I question that because yes, Xi is supreme leader now, but he wasn't at the time. So how exactly did he get to that position? He couldn't have just waltzed into it. There has to have been some kind of process behind that, right? And so obviously people missed that process. They missed that signal. And I think it's important that we kind of uncover this because the narrative that Xi is this kind of like overarching puppet master who I don't know whether he's supposedly blackmailed or like has something over the entire party, it doesn't really hold water when you actually look into it for more than like 5 minutes. I also want to discuss a little bit why people thought that Xi was going to be not that remarkable of a leader, potentially more liberal or reformist, or at least on par with Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Somebody who wouldn't really leave that much of a mark, let alone go on to become essentially the emperor of China. Also, just to quickly address, before I get people in the comments leaving things like, well, actually Xi Jinping isn't really emperor of China and they only abolished presidential term limits and it doesn't mean that he'll be party secretary for the rest of his life. Let me just stop you there. We're gonna cut that off right there because for all intents and purposes, Xi Jinping is the supreme leader for life of a one-party state containing multiple ethnic groups who are subjugated to the dominant cultural authority at the expense of their own expression. That's something that we call an empire. He presides over the singular form of government as the leader of both the state, the party apparatus, and the military. So yes, he is the emperor. I will not be taking any further questions at this time. Also, for the purposes of this episode, we're going to kind of be merging the party and the government of China together. Normally, I would try and separate them out a bit, but actually, it does make more sense in this specific context to kind of merge them together, and that will become apparent a bit later on. When it comes to why people thought Xi wouldn't be a remarkable leader and definitely wouldn't end up as supreme leader, things are divided into 3 sort of separate categories. So there's like analysis of Xi himself, analysis of where China was, and analysis of the state of the party at the time in 2012. So we're going to cover all of those separately and then at the end bring them all together to discuss how it was that Xi became supreme leader, not by kind of doing some sort of slick power grab, but actually with the consensus of the CCP. But first, as always, we are going to have a little bit of historical context, this time in the form of Xi Jinping's backstory. I'm not going to do a full biography. I just kind of want to pick out the points that are actually relevant to this discussion and how that then went on to affect his ascent to ultimate leadership. So Xi Jinping's known as a princeling in China, which essentially refers to the children of former high-ranking officials. So the kind of like OG were with Mao at Yan'an officials who were high-ranking within the party during the Maoist years. It's kind of important to note that this is a categorical group of people. It's not the same thing as a clique. And I think that's an important distinction to make right off the bat, because the idea of guanxi groups versus actual cliques within the CCP does come into play into how Xi Jinping was chosen as a leader. So Xi's father is a man called Xi Jinping. He was an old school revolutionary veteran. He was unfortunately purged during the Cultural Revolution, like many high-ranking officials, but that was not the end of his career, as again was the case for many high-ranking officials who were purged during the Cultural Revolution. He ended up being reinstated and went on to become a leading figure of Guangdong province during the Reform and Opening Up era, and then later on he became a member of the Politburo, which is the second highest body within the Chinese Communist Party. He ended up resigning, partly because it was almost his time to resign, but also because he defended a man called Hu Yaobang in 1989 over Hu Yaobang's sort of plans to liberalize the party a bit, and also defending the students at Tiananmen Square. He wasn't forced out per se, but it's kind of heavily implied that his disagreements with other people within the party was the reason that he just decided to like back out, essentially. And all of this is kind of interpreted to mean that generally throughout his career, elder Xi Jinping, was more partial to liberal ideas, potentially reformist ideas as well. And that's important because this is something that is projected onto Xi Jinping later on. Xi Jinping's own career did have an impact, both positive and negative, on Xi Jinping, because when he was purged from his position within the party, Xi Jinping was sent down to the countryside to perform hard labor as part of the sending the youth down to the countryside movement during the Cultural Revolution. Xi now says that, this is what helped him forge close ties with the masses and, understand the value of hard work and hard labor and the true conditions of China, if you will. But it also should be noted that he did try and run away from this hard work, as I probably would too, to be honest, if I was like a coddled child from Beijing. But it's not as if he enjoyed his time there. It was very hard, very grueling. And I think a lot of people might think that, well, in that case, why would he then go on to support a party that had kind of dumped him and his father and kind of like denounced his entire family? But within the CCP, in any case, it doesn't really work like that. It's not as if Xi Jinping's story is particularly unique. This happened to a lot of this sort of like princeling group of people. Their families had to survive the vicissitudes of the Maoist era, being purged, being brought back in. This didn't happen just once or twice, this was like a constant thing. So it was more like a battle of survival, if you will, and something that people, I suppose, were psychologically attuned to. It didn't make them hate the party or dislike the party. In fact, Xi Jinping applied to join the Communist Youth League and the CCP itself like a dozen times before finally being accepted. It's way more of like a rite of passage and a formative experience than it was something that would impact their psyche negatively. It's not like, well, Xi Jinping went through all these hard times, it was the CCP's fault, and then he's going to try and bring them down. Like, not at all. If anything, that only entrenched further his dedication to the party and his need to belong, essentially. And also, it should be borne in mind that when his father is reinstated later on, Xi was able to then follow a very comfortable path in his political career. Because his father had all these very high-level connections, Xi Jinping was able to go to a good university where he studied engineering. He went through all the typical administrative roles in Hebei province. He then went on to work in Fujian, Zhejiang, Shanghai. He ended up being the party secretary of Shanghai. Interestingly, at the time when he was in Shanghai, a lot of people were like, well, maybe this is as far as he goes. He hasn't done anything particularly spectacular with his career. He's not very remarkable in general. Maybe he makes it to the Politburo, maybe he doesn't, but no one really expected him to go as far as making it to the standing committee. He wasn't like a known. People weren't really talking about him in that sense at the time. Something else to note here is that Xi Jinping kind of straddled two different opposing cliques within the top levels of the CCP at the time. You've got like Jiang Zemin's Shanghai clique and Hu Jintao's Communist Youth League clique. And I won't go into too much detail about who was in each one and how they worked exactly, but needless to say, there had been kind of like a power struggle between the two groups over the past decade or two. Both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao were chosen directly by Deng Xiaoping to be the next leaders of China. And the person after Hu Jintao would be the first person who would not have been chosen by a revolutionary OG cadre to become leader. So it was up to these different cliques, these different sort of like struggling factions to come together to make that decision. He would have ended up being like a compromise between the two as opposed to like a strong choice for either side. And some people think that that's the reason why he ended up being selected in the end. China was still trying to institutionalize this method of choosing the next heir apparent. Jiang Zemin actually wasn't supposed to be the next leader. It was supposed to be a man called Zhao Ziyang, RIP. We can talk about Zhao Ziyang in a different episode, but essentially the smoothness of the transition wasn't yet set in stone. And so the next choice, whether it be Xi Jinping or Li Keqiang, this was the time where it was seen that, okay, the CCP is trying to make an actual process out of this and set these term limits of 10 years in stone. But once he did get the job, people then immediately start speculating about what kind of leader he'll be. And it's at this point that we start heading down the road of misconceptions. I think it's fairly safe to say that predictions about what kind of leader Xi Jinping would end up being ranged from kind of wrong to very wrong. In an article in 2012, The Guardian wrote, quote, "To read Xi as a man in sole control of the agenda is to fundamentally misunderstand the Chinese political system. He will be the first among equals in the 9-member standing committee, say analysts. Hu Jintao and other former leaders will still exert influence, and 2011's 5-year plan has plotted the immediate course. The system is in favour of moderation, and nothing can change quickly. Steady as it goes, the political rhythm first has to be installed, significant shifts will come later," said Dr. David Kelly, director of the Beijing-based political think tank China Policy. His leadership will be shaped by his colleagues and framed by external forces. What's very important is the capacity to be on the right side of history, says Chung Li of the Brookings Institution in Washington. He himself probably does not know what he'll do. I don't have time today to discuss all the reasons why think tanks stress me out, but it's not as if it's just one think tank guy or two think tank guys in a Guardian article who have this opinion. The prevailing sentiment at the time is that Xi Jinping would have a very like straight and narrow career, if not become a full-on reformer. Given his background, it was expected that Xi Jinping would be able to do something, at least, so that he would have some sort of influence over the party, but no one was expecting him to leave a huge mark. Yu Punhui, who's the founder and chairman of Tsinghua University Center for US-China Relations and the Peking University Chinese Culture Research Center, wrote in his 2012 article, "What Kind of Leader Will Xi Jinping Be?" quote, "Some analysts believe that Xi may possibly be another Deng, albeit a much younger man confronted with very different political dynamics. Xi is expected to manage the ideological debate with great skill and diligence, but remain reform-minded at the same time, since economic and social infrastructures require his continuous attention. Xi Jinping will be China's leader for the next 10 years. His focus could be to further strengthen the organization of the party in a move to have the party's leadership work to reconstruct the value system of the people." And I mean, he's only like 80% wrong. This is why I never try and predict anything about China, because like, you could be the highest authority in the land and know everything there is to know about how the party works and still get it that wrong. Jean-Pierre Cabestan, who is the professor of political science at Hong Kong Baptist University, also wrote in 2012 that Xi Jinping will need the full support of the outgoing team, and in particular of Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, the PLA, and the security apparatus in order to succeed. The weakening of the conservative camp and the necessity for reforms will help, as will the provinces that have already embarked on at least some structural measures that China must now implement on the advice of government reformists. However, China is undoubtedly entering a zone of deeper political uncertainty, if not upheaval. Xi will therefore need to bring into play all the talents we know him to possess to succeed in leading the world's second largest economy towards political, institutional, and legal environment that is more in tune with the expectations of its population and the international community. Lastly, and above all, we must not forget that in presiding over the destiny of a society in rapid transformation, Xi will doubtless be forced, depending on circumstances, to take decisions and introduce reforms to which he is currently opposed, or even some that he cannot at present imagine. Well, that wasn't true, was it? These aren't particularly disastrously wrong predictions. It's more that the tone is completely incorrect here. People are able to predict China's trajectory in terms of, say, the economy needing some fundamental changes, the government wanting a more internal consumption-based model as opposed to like a foreign direct investment or like a manufacturing model. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's been achieved, but at least they've got some insight into what is being planned and what the thoughts and feelings of the party are in that aspect. A lot of people thought that Xi would be conservative, but that's not very surprising given, again, his background, and the CCP in general prefers conservative leaders. But the idea that Xi Jinping would need a lot of support, not just in terms of consensus, because I agree that the consensus is necessary, but almost like Xi Jinping wouldn't be able to make decisions for himself. He wouldn't be able to pick and choose what he wanted to do. He would have to basically go running to Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin or whomever, the old party cadres, in order to make any decision, and also base a lot of his decisions on international expectations and start moving the party in line with, say, you know, what the West wanted, or the UN or the World Bank or whomever. Yeah, those are all wrong. That is not what ended up happening at all. And it's funny because these sorts of predictions that Xi would have to do these sorts of things end up giving way to a lot of grandstanding, for want of a better word. A lot of assertions, if you will, from certain parties about what China would have to do under Xi Jinping, what Xi Jinping would have to do in order to save China from imminent collapse. Mr. Xi could start by giving a little more power to China's people. The judicial system should offer people an answer to their grievances. The household registration or hukou system should be phased out to allow family of rural migrants access to properly funded healthcare and education. He should start to loosen the party's grip. A free press would be a vital ally in the battle against corruption. Ultimately, this newspaper hopes, political reform would make the party answerable to the courts and, as the purest expression of this, free political prisoners. It would curb the power of the propaganda department to impose censorship and scrap the Central Military Commission. A timetable should be set for directly electing government officials, starting with townships in the countryside and districts in the cities, perhaps allowing 5 years for those experiments to settle in, before taking direct elections up to the county level in rural areas, then in prefectures, then later provinces, leading all the way to competitive elections for national leaders. Suggesting a full-blown transition to democratic elections in like 5 years is like something only The Economist could come up with, and I say this as somebody who read The Economist like it was the Bible when I was in my 20s. But the reason that people were able to come up with crazy predictions like this didn't actually stem from an assessment of Xi Jinping himself, but rather from an assessment of where China was at the time. So if we look at the major stories and events and scandals and things that had occurred in China over the past 10 years or so, it was not really surprising that by the time you get to 2012, people thought that the country and the CCP were in for a really big change. It was clear that China had reached some sort of inflection point, and people were basically trying to predict whether they would go one way or another. But what becomes clear when you sort of read into it a bit more is that there's a lot of projection, people sort of hoping that China will go down a liberal route as opposed to actually reading the warning signals about what's really going to happen. So it's worth looking at some of the problems that China was facing in the early noughties and kind of looking at why some people thought they would be solved one way, i.e. liberal democracy, and then looking at what actually happened instead. So in 2012, actually, there is a speech by Hu Jintao, which is his report to the 18th National Congress of the Communist Party, which is essentially his handover speech. And as part of this speech, he has a big chunk about what, what's China going through right now? What kind of problems are we facing here? We must be keenly aware that there is still much room for improvement in our work, and there are a lot of difficulties and problems on our road ahead. They include the following: unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable development, the capacity for scientific and technological innovation being weak, industrial structure is unbalanced, agricultural infrastructure remains weak, resource and environment constraints have become more serious, the development gap between urban and rural areas and between regions is still large, and so are income disparities. Social problems have increased. There are many problems affecting people's immediate interests in education, employment, social security, healthcare, housing, the ecological environment, food and drug safety, workplace safety, public security, law enforcement, administration of justice, etc. Some people still lead hard lives. Some community-level party organizations are weak and lax. A small number of party members and officials waver in the party's ideal and conviction and are not fully aware of its purpose. Going through formalities and bureaucratism as well as extravagance and waste are a serious problem. Some sectors are prone to corruption and others misconduct, and the fight against corruption remains a serious challenge for us. We must take these difficulties and problems very seriously and work harder to resolve them. So the party's going through a rocky patch, you might say. It's quite interesting that Hu Jintao not only acknowledges this, but actually lists out exactly what needs to be dealt with. And it's basically everything. Let's pick out a few of these issues and kind of talk about them in a bit more detail so that we can get that context a bit more drilled down. We're going to start with my favorite category, which is political scandal. We're going to take quite a well-known example here. This is by no means the only example of political scandal, but I think it's worth talking about the Xi Jinping incident as the foremost prominent illustrative example of why people thought that the CCP was on its knees in 2012. So between 2007 and 2012, Xi Jinping was the party secretary of Chongqing, which was at the time China's largest city, and he was also a member of the Politburo and at one point a favourite to potentially be promoted to the Standing Committee and even maybe the next leader of China. So his story isn't actually too dissimilar from Xi Jinping's. He's also a princeling. His father was Bo Yibo, who I mentioned earlier was a minister of finance who was purged during the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping himself was also sent down to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution and then was only able to join the party much later. Blah, 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 blah. The only difference between him and most of the other princelings is that he didn't study engineering. He studied like history and journalism or something like that. But for all intents and purposes, he's got a very similar story to someone like Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping was known for being a bit more of a character than most other CCP leaders. When he became leader of Chongqing, he introduced something known as the Chongqing model, which included things like a huge anti-corruption campaign, in which almost 6,000 criminals, police officers, judges, and party officials were arrested. Some people didn't like this because they felt that Bo was using the campaign as an excuse to get rid of a lot of his own political enemies. So he used to play to the crowd a lot as well. He introduced something called like the Red Culture Movement, which was basically getting people to get back to the spirit of Maoism and the glory days or whatever, and getting them to sing lots of revolutionary songs and have big parades and things like that. He used to send people text messages with quotes from Mao's Little Red Book, which is just crazy. Like if the mayor of London started sending you like quotes from like Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee, that would just be really weird. This was also criticized because not everybody had really fond memories of things like the Cultural Revolution, funnily enough. That was still very much in living memory at the time. But he also pushed a lot of foreign direct investment, fast economic growth. He used to do a lot of social housing projects and things like that. So really, again, playing to the populist side of politics, really trying to appeal to the masses. So imagine everyone's surprise when it turns out that he was the biggest gangster of them all. So apparently a lot of people in the top leadership didn't really like him that much because he was very like charming and charismatic and, you know, would like cozy up to foreign officials and things like that. And people like Hu Jintao didn't really like that because it kind of felt like he was trying to build up his own little cult of personality, and you know, he was very obviously vying for the top job. It's kind of it's not the done thing within the CCP, if you will. So when he did take a tumble, so to speak, a lot of people saw that as maybe the top officials trying to get rid of him. But when we look at the evidence, I don't think that is the case. So basically what happened to him is that his chief of police in Chongqing is a man called Wang Lijun. And what Bo got Wang to do was essentially a wiretapping exercise, a bit like an NSA thing in the US that was exposed by Snowden. The campaign was basically to listen in on people's conversations, seeing if they were spilling state secrets, see what they were saying about Bo Xilai and things like that. Again, people saying that he was using this as a way to spy on his enemies and get rid of them. But ostensibly, it was to kind of protect the security of the state and the party. What eventually came out, though, was that Bo was wiretapping top officials of the party as well, so people like Hu Jintao. And so an investigation was launched into this. Bo Xilai apparently threw Wang Lijun under the bus and said, like, he was the one who did it had nothing to do with me. During which process, Wang Lijun actually found out that Bo Xilai had been spying on his conversations as well, so had been wiretapping the wiretapper. So all of this kind of sent Wang Lijun over the edge. He ended up fleeing to the American embassy in Chengdu and spilling all the beans about the corruption going on. And is like, hey, you know that guy Neil Haywood who died? I know who did it. It was Bo Xilai's wife, Gu Kailai. Now, who is Neil Haywood? Why do we care? So Neil Haywood is a British businessman, or was a British businessman, who was very good friends with Bo Xilai's wife, Gu Kailai, and was apparently one of the connections that they used to get their son into Harrow, which is a very prestigious private school in the UK. He also apparently was like the Bo family's money mover and would like move their assets to different countries and hide it for them. And a dispute allegedly broke out between the two. I say allegedly, this woman has been convicted for this man's murder, but whatever. They were apparently fighting because he wanted more commission for the work he was doing. Gu was becoming uncomfortable with this, and then her and her secretary conspired to poison this man in a hotel room, chalk it up to alcohol poisoning. His family was like, he doesn't drink alcohol. Everything was brushed over until Wang Lijun ran off and started spilling the beans to the American embassy. The American embassy does not care. They kick Wang Lijun out. He is immediately picked up by the authorities, who then question him, but tell everybody that he's like taken a mental health break for some reason. I don't know why they did that. He ends up arrested, and then Bo Xilai is forced to step down, forced to stand on trial. His wife also stands on trial. They are both convicted. She is convicted of murder. He is convicted of like corruption and money laundering, all sorts of things. She gets imprisoned for 15 years, I believe, and he gets a suspended death penalty and is imprisoned for life. So I need you to understand that this is the moment where everyone was like, okay, the CCP might be over. Even if the party were to survive, they were going to have to overhaul everything, because this wasn't just like your everyday typical corruption scandal. Bo Xilai wasn't just some guy. He was going to be on the Politburo Standing Committee. He was a decision maker, and it turns out that he was running a mafia in his own city. And also within China at the time, this is causing a bit of debate because, as I said, some people felt that this was all a conspiracy to bring Bo Xilai down and he was actually innocent, and that the party were, you know, just like scrabbling because they didn't like him. It's not so much whether or not it's true or not. I think it's true personally, but that's just what I think. It's more the fact that this is all being discussed in public. This usually very secretive one-party state that's a bit of a monolith that has very tight censorship controls over the media. All of their, you know, dirty laundry is being aired in public. And like I mentioned, this compounds with other issues that are going on in China at the time. Something that was happening then that is no longer happening is that the number of protests, civil public unrest that took place in China every year was actually being recorded. and in the noughties and 2010s, this number was on the rise. China's Academy of Social Sciences reported that there were more than 60,000 mass incidents in 2006 and over 80,000 in 2007. Although official figures are no longer published, there's credible evidence indicating that there were more than 90,000 mass incidents in 2009, and in 2010, according to one source from Tsinghua University, there were over 180,000 separate incidents of unrest recorded across the country. The protests were always for different reasons, usually because of corrupt local officials taking the piss. Some of these incidents, like the Wukan incident that I actually wrote my undergraduate thesis about, actually made international news. So these things were catching the eye of international audiences. Things like the arrest of high-profile activists, people like Ai Weiwei, these things were becoming big news both in China and abroad. In his speech, Hu Jintao also mentioned something about like food safety, and that really just took me back to my time in China. Like, wow, that was a trip down memory lane. I think I was actually going on my year abroad to China when the gutter oil and hair in soy sauce scandals were still ongoing or had just started. And I think that also kind of crossed over with the dead pigs in the Yangtze River and in the Shanghai tap water incidents. It wasn't a good few years for China's food PR, like, at all. And to be fair, I don't think it's actually recovered that well. We eat a lot more food from China than we know, but I think if people knew that, they would be more upset than they know. Now, people who have actually been to China know that, you know, generally speaking, the food is fine, and actually some of the best food of your life will be eaten in the absolutely most disgusting locations you could ever go to. My personal favorite restaurant was actually just like a concrete block with no doors, no windows, located directly next to an open air dumpster, and occasionally had like an animal, like a goat or something, tied up outside that would be alive for a week, and then the next week its head would be in a bowl and the skin would be drying in the sun on a rack. Just, you know, typical China things. But they had the best gongbao jiding of my life, so like, what can I say? Like, the food was really good and I survived and it was fine, but in the news, this wasn't good. Like, China's food wasn't doing good. The economy also wasn't doing good. It was slowing down a lot. China's economy had been on the rise since the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis between 1997 and 1998, and they had managed to sustain double-digit figure growth between 2003 to 2008. However, it was dropping below 10%, and by 2012 was around the 7% mark. People were starting to ask questions about how China would either bring it back or how they would adapt to the newly slowing economic growth, considering that there were still some parts of the country that were still in poverty and hadn't caught up to other areas. Even within the party, there was a debate as to whether or not there should be reform. Like, do we go down the liberal reformist route, or do we stay conservative and just try and like tough it out, essentially? The rise of more vocal political intellectual groups was being noted by different observers. You've got people like the New Left, Democratic Socialists, Nationalists, Neo-Confucianists, neoliberals, pluralists, all these different political groups now coming to the fore and essentially demanding some form of reform. All groups now agree that their country is facing a serious crisis and radical reforms are needed to address it. The debates, in fact, focus on the kind of political reform China should have and how it should be implemented. The left side has expressed its dissatisfaction with the current no-reform situation and opined that this would continue to weaken the CCP. By contrast, the right side is suspicious of the current system and believes that fundamental reforms such as forms of democratic constitutionalism must be introduced. The most important development is the rise of political intellectuals who have strong political backgrounds and are courageous enough to speak out on sensitive issues. In this group, the descendants of the old revolutionaries, the princelings, and retired party state cadres have played leading roles. An example can be seen in the Association of Yan'an Descendants, whose members claim to be the daughters and sons of old revolutionaries who are not in power. In their open letter to the forthcoming 18th Party Congress, they called for intra-party democracy by introducing direct elections of CCP leaders at every level. Premier Wen Jiabao, currently the CCP's number 3 leader, has repeatedly called for political reforms beginning in August 2010. Wen has repeated his preference for political reform on both domestic and international occasions. Most recently, on September 14th, 2011, Wen again elaborated his ideas in a dialogue with entrepreneurs. This time, Wen emphasized 5 points, ranging from the separation between the Communist Party and the state to expanding the people's democracy through elections. The fact that these debates were taking place at all, albeit in elite circles, is again very unusual given China's usual very tight control over these sorts of political discussions. There were times in the 80s and 90s where these sorts of things were a bit more common, but since crackdowns in 2001 and 2006, they had been completely banned in political spaces and in the media. So you've got all these problems going on, you've got these potential solutions, and then you add in Xi Jinping to the mix. And the problem that people have here is that no one can get a good read on him. This is a problem, of course, because if you have problems plus potential solutions plus the person who's going to enact them, if you don't know anything about the person who's going to enact them, you're probably just going to assume that they're going to take on any suggestions or the strongest suggestions that are thrown their way, as opposed to having any opinion of their own. This is summarized quite nicely if we go back to the article by Kabistan. At the international level, Xi has gained a wealth of experience in recent years, much more if measured in the number of trips than his predecessor. However, during these official visits, he sought to emphasize his personal charm rather than original ideas. The substance of his speeches has mostly remained within well-defined limits, coded or insignificant. China's major partners, headed by the United States, are having difficulty identifying any special or original outlook in Xi. On military and security questions, we are no better informed. The shortage of information does not mean that Xi lacks charisma. On the contrary, if a major difference between Xi and Hu exists, it's certainly that unlike his predecessor, when he enters an assembly, Xi makes his presence felt immediately. He smiles and is expressive, warm and communicative. He gives the impression of being human, made of flesh and blood, a person with feelings, tastes and preferences rather than a robot or prison door. He is, moreover, a far better communicator than his predecessor. This does not tell us what Xi will do once he comes to power. So at the point at which Xi is elected to party general secretary, nobody knows anything about how he will react to any social problems, military problems, financial problems, political problems, basically anything. They don't know anything at all. Some people even went as far to say that he would just be a weak leader who would do nothing, basically. Willie Wo-Lap Lam, former China editor of the South China Morning Post, says that Xi Jinping will be a very weak leader. Firstly, he's not charismatic and he lacks a power network comparable to the Shanghai faction of Jiang Zemin and the Communist Youth League faction of Hu Jintao. His key crony, General Li Yuan, is finished due to his association with Bo Xilai. His presidency will be overshadowed by the political heavyweights who enabled his rise to power, the country's previous two presidents. There are some more decent predictions that say things like, Xi is not very likely to be manipulated by the West, and, you can't really try and predict what kind of world leader he's going to be based on no information or by comparing him to, say, former Soviet leaders or whatever the case may be. But generally speaking, people are kind of projecting the state of China onto Xi himself. You've got a brittle regime that's far less monolithic and assured than many foreigners assume, and therefore Xi's own accession to power is just as brittle and weak. Too many Westerners, including those urging trade sanctions over the UN, assume that they are dealing with a self-confident, rational power that has come of age. Think instead of a paranoid, introspective imperial court already struggling to keep up with its subjects and now embarking on a slightly awkward succession, and you may be less disappointed. In his first year, when he introduced the anti-corruption campaign and announced that the one-child policy will be scrapped completely, people at least felt that he was a herald of change. But again, this was more in the vein of the party needed these reforms in order to maintain its power base, and so Xi had to do these anyway and was probably persuaded by other members of the party to do so. Even when there were signs that Xi Jinping had no intention of reforming, like there was apparently this leaked document where he was like, no, we're not doing that. There were still people who believed that he had no choice but to bow to external and internal pressures. Like there was no way that he would be able to turn this thing into a one-man dictatorship because there were too many stresses on him. The costs and risks of not delivering such reasonable reforms will only grow in the years ahead. As China's leaders engage in discussions about the country's falling economic growth rate, the housing bubble, and the banking crisis, they may believe, rightly, that they hold the keys to bring about essential transformations. They also have the support of a rising middle class, eager for state-owned enterprise reform, tax cuts, and assurances that their housing investments are safe. But at the same time, the leaders must realise that without gradual but bold reform of the legal system, media openness, and more accountable and representative political structures, the next phase of economic reform will not go far. I could literally only find one article made by one guy who is a venture capitalist in Shanghai, who is basically like, the party's not going to fall, that's not going to happen. Like, it's way more secure than people now outside see. People are just seeing these sort of like external signals, but the CCP is formed in such a way that they are specifically designed to be able to cope with this sort of extreme pressure, and it's if anything, it will make the country and the party stronger, not weaker. So it's very easy to see how people were underestimating Xi Jinping, why they had such little confidence in him, and why there was very little suspicion, at least in 2012, that he would ever become supreme leader for life of the country. So now that we know why people didn't see it coming, the question is, how did Xi manage to pull the tide back in his favour, overcome all of these difficulties, and reach a position where he was able to basically have dominion over the party and the entire country? If we were to consult an outlet like, say, the New York Times, we would learn that Xi deployed speed, secrecy, and intimidation to smother potential opposition inside and outside the party. He swept past the consensus-building conventions that previous leaders used to amend the constitution. He installed loyalists to draft and support the amendments, and he kept the whole process under the tight control of the party, allowing little debate even internally. And while this would be just like a lovely little bow-wrapped present of an explanation, it feels kind of sad to say it, but the real reason that Xi was able to amass such power is way more administratively heavy and boring, and not as slick at all as this kind of article would have you believe. So there were a lot of reforms that were carried out in order to strengthen the party. For example, that you have the anti-corruption campaign. But by 2016, there were some people who were starting to interpret these sorts of campaigns and reforms as a slow maneuvering of Xi Jinping to get rid of opposition and to put himself in a more secure position. A critical aspect of Xi's governance approach is its high degree of power centralization. Through several institutional reforms, he's brought about the party-state's military, security, foreign affairs, and economic power hierarchies under his direct control. His anti-corruption campaign has arrested a large number of very powerful figures, including the former security czar of the Chinese Communist Party, Zhou Yongkang. Many are worried that he's creating a cult of personality, and that he's become as powerful as former paramount leaders such as Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. This has led some China watchers to ask whether he is turning China into one-man rule. Some even view Xi's ambitious reform as a sign of the communist regime's struggling at the end of its life. For example, Schamburg argues that Chinese communist rule has now reached its endgame, and Xi Jinping's ruthless measures are bringing the country closer to a breaking point. Which is a shame, because I usually like Schamburg, but he's wrong. While the overview is correct that Xi Jinping had introduced new bodies of power that were helping him centralize both the top leadership's power and Xi's own power, and the anti-corruption campaign did get rid of high-profile officials, the interpretation of these events is not exactly correct, and the final analysis that this would therefore lead to the downfall of the party so far has not come true. Xi was cracking down quite a lot on the freedom and openness of discussion that had been a bit more prevalent in the previous years. Things like the discussions amongst political intellectuals, or even at universities, about things like freedom of press or democracy, judicial independence. These were all being banned. Civil society groups were being cracked down on. Foreign reporters were starting to be denied visas. But while these sort of heavy-handed repressive actions were taking place, there were more boring aspects to what Xi was doing that helped him centralize his power. So he actually created two new political bodies. The first was the National Security Commission, and the second was the Central Committee Leadership Small Group on Comprehensively Deepening Reform, both of which were headed by Xi himself. So the National Security Commission was specifically made to oversee, coordinate and direct state and security bodies, including the Ministry of Public Security, the Police, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of State Security, and the PLA intelligence departments. So it deals with things like anti-terrorism, internet security, information security. And then the other group, which is the Small Leadership Group on Comprehensively Deepening Reform, is tasked with the design and implementation of different reforms. And these are like small groups, small task force that are like run by, very small team leaders, basically. It was also eventually established that the power over any final economic reforms or economic plans would be given to Xi Jinping as opposed to Li Keqiang, who was the premier. Normally, the general process throughout modern Chinese history was that the premier would deal with the economic and sort of like state governance side of things. But it was clear that these sorts of roles were going from the state side to the party side, and therefore from the premier to the president or to the general party secretary, who is Xi Jinping. So this all means that in a short period of time, Xi had formalized his control over the military, over national security, over foreign affairs and economic affairs, as well as state building and ideological work of the party. So at this point, people are asking questions like, okay, is this all for the sake of the party, or is this specifically for Xi Jinping's personal agenda? Is this so that he can accrue more power to himself? It was clear that Xi was definitely going for a more top-down approach as opposed to the decentralization that had been taking place under Deng Xiaoping. He wasn't for that collective leadership nonsense anymore. It was clear that more and more decision-making powers were going to be going to fewer and fewer people. There were some tentative predictions that Xi could be gearing up for a dictatorship-style leadership regime by 2016, so a couple of years before the announcement was made. When the 20th Party Congress meets in 2022, Xi will have passed the retirement age of 67 for the Politburo and the Politburo Standing Committee, and he will have served 2 terms as president by the following spring. If the rule of political exit, formed since the 90s, holds, Xi is supposed to hand over power at that party congress. But if he decides to formally retain his acquired powers, this will be the single biggest indicator of his achievement of an imperial presidency and becoming as powerful as Mao or Deng. If Xi is abolishing and defying key party rules to enhance his personal power, this might mean that the Chinese regime is entering the frozen post-totalitarian stage and becoming a personalistic dictatorship. This could lead to an explosion if the public gathers sufficient energy for a revolution against party guile, or an implosion when the system collapses due to internal struggles. The centralization of power to the party didn't necessarily mean the supreme leadership of Xi Jinping. He could have very easily still gone on to pass on that power to the next person, whoever that may be, while still getting rid of the idea of like collective leadership and party factional infighting and things like that. So that's why most people missed the signals. But another argument that often comes up is that Xi Jinping also took his own party by surprise, and that the CCP didn't want him to become supreme leader either. Again, if we go back to the New York Times article as an example of this sentiment, it suggests that Xi Jinping was actually working against the best interests of the party, and that he just relied on a handful of basically his own cronies and like allies in order to secure his top position. If we look at sort of the general broader analysis, I don't think that this could possibly be the case. Ironically, most analysis actually supports the idea that the CCP isn't a dictatorship by one man. It is a collective body that makes decisions, and it has to have that consensus. And as such, the consensus was that Xi Jinping should be the ultimate leader of the party. After more than 3 decades in which China seemed determined to institutionalize collective leadership and move away from personalistic leadership, the consolidation of Xi's individual power and the dramatic speed with which it took place during his first years in office could not have occurred without the consent and active support of other senior members of China's ruling elite. The widespread support among China's senior leaders for this shift back to a strongman leadership derived from a shared sense that the party and the state were facing severe threats of the scale that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that these threats could only be dealt with if political power was centralized in the hands of a single, all-powerful leader. To be certain, since he came to power, Xi has proved himself to be a strong, shrewd, visionary, and purposeful leader. Rather, the argument is that despite all of his capabilities and competence, the swift concentration of so much power in his hands, at least in his early years, was not the result of only his individual will and actions, but also and mainly the result of the will and actions of other senior leaders. This is really important because if you actually look at what happened in the party at the time when Xi was accruing all this power and then abolished term limits, there was no resistance at all within the party. There were no cryptic speeches or leaked documents or closed door conversations that were later revealed in emails to The Economist or whoever. It kind of bears stating that there were very powerful people within the CCP who would have had to actively give up their own power and give it to Xi Jinping in order for him to become supreme leader. It was not his decision to make, and it was not the decision of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 even of his allies. It would have to have been decided by the incumbent leaders of the Central Military Commission, people like Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and all of the Politburo Standing Committee members. They would have had to make that decision as a team that it was okay for Xi Jinping to immediately become head of state and head of the military, which hadn't been done before, and also take over all of the economic planning and have final say on the general direction of China, institute things like the anti-corruption campaign, the China Dream, the next 5-year plans, riling up tensions with the US, basically becoming the spokesperson, the sole spokesperson for China on the international stage, and having the say over absolutely everything that everybody else does. In 2007, Hu Jintao had apparently made a statement saying that we need more collective leadership, we need more democratic centralism, we need to strengthen the division of responsibilities among different people. But when it came to 2012, he never mentioned that again. So it seems as if in that 5-year period, at least Hu Jintao, who was head of state, changed his mind about how China should be run. And again, it's not as if he would have come to that decision by himself. At the time, people within the party were incredibly self-aware about what was going on and what the problems were. It's not like they didn't see these signs. It's not like they didn't know what was going on within their own country. It was no longer Maoist China where people weren't allowed to point out the fact that half of the countryside is starving. People were very aware of these issues. The fact that people were, being more vocal with their problems with the CCP, and the fact that this had to change. The speech by Hu Jintao that I was quoted from near the beginning of this episode wasn't just his own personal sentiment. It's like a generalized fear among the entire party. Issues like the wealth gap, separatist movements in outlying provinces, slowing economic growth, these issues weren't things that could be solved quickly. And they probably couldn't be solved with collective leadership, because collective leadership was kind of the root of the problem in the first place. And Bo Xilai and his scandal was an example of that. The fact that there was too much decentralization was what had allowed him to accrue so much personal power in such a short amount of time within his own little city-state, create a mafia, completely corrupt the entire system, and then have to be thrown out to the shame of China on the global stage. Xi's new party reforms of top-down design and systemic thinking were very much welcomed by people in the party who felt that, we need to tighten up people's ideological thinking. We need cadres to be loyal to the party. If that means that they have to be loyal to an individual within that party, and Xi kind of acts as the totem, the representative, the core or the essence of the party overall, then that's just what we're gonna have to do. It wasn't a power grab that took the party by surprise. I think that analysis is incorrect. It's more like dictatorship by committee, if that makes sense. It's a lot less exciting, but it's probably a lot closer to the truth as well. And again, it's probably why a lot of people missed it. Xi's supreme leadership came not with a bang, but with a whimper, if you will. It's the steady setting up of new committees with new oversights and shuffling around the work that different groups have to do and like slowly transferring the oversight of the economy from Li Keqiang to Xi Jinping. It was boring. It's boring, it's bureaucratic, it's administrative, it's slow, and as humans we tend to overlook things that are boring and slow and like 60-page long speeches until it's too late, basically, which is exactly what happened in this case. What many pundits and China watchers and the like had viewed as a weak CCP was in reality a lost CCP, which isn't quite the same thing. And what was seen as like a maniacal and like psychopathic Xi Jinping was probably closer to like someone who was like shrewd and was willing to exchange power to get power. It's very important that we don't overlook the role of the party itself. The CCP was not unaware of its problems. It was hyper aware of its problems. And it had the power still to choose its own path. It wasn't being forced down any particular road. It wasn't being dragged along by international pressure. It wasn't beholden to any sort of like foreign direct investment that might be withheld if they didn't make like democracy the day after tomorrow. The choice to ensure the future of the entire country and place that future in the hands of one man was something that they chose to do. It remains to be seen whether or not it pays off in the end, but we have to acknowledge that that is a conscious choice made by the CCP and not a power grab by Xi Jinping alone. So that's it for today's story, guys. I hope you enjoyed that little walk down Xi Jinping's path to becoming emperor. As with all of my episodes, I think it ended up being a lot more boring than exciting. These things always seem exciting on the surface, but at the end of the day, a lot of politics is just really boring yapping. But regardless, I hope you learned something from this. If you enjoyed watching or listening to this episode, please do give it a like on whatever platform you are consuming this information on. Don't forget to also subscribe to the Substack. And if you want to give me a little bit of extra support, I do have a Buy Me a Coffee page as well, where you can see the full transcripts for these episodes and you get all of my list of resources and all the research that I've done. The people that I've quoted for this episode is not every bit of reading that I did. Trust me, there was a lot of reading. It's very exhausting doing these things. I think I've been recording this episode for like 2 hours now. Hopefully I can get it down to 45 minutes. You're unironically listening to the condensed version right now. I am going on holiday next week, so there might not be any content for a while, but watch this space. I might do a couple of Substacks, and I'm planning what is hopefully a slightly more interesting episode coming up very soon. So I hope you guys tune in then, and I will see you in the next one.